Today, we take a look at the most terrifying last moments of pet owners. From a creator who grew so comfortable with his pet cassowary that he ignored his own safety protocols, to a chimp owner who thought a single command could stop a frantic attack until it was too late. But first, a birthday celebration where a woman stepped into the enclosure of a white lion she had known since birth. Unaware this time, it no longer saw her the same way. It was February 14th, 2017, in a private wildlife compound outside Johannesburg, where the late afternoon heat settled over concrete enclosures and dry earth. The air was still, broken only by distant movement behind barriers, as long shadows stretched across the grounds under a fading, cloudless sky. Isabelle Voss, 24, had spent her life on her family's licensed wildlife property outside Pretoria, helping care for animals her father had raised from cubs. When she was 6 years old, her father brought home Aslan, an 8-week-old white lion, and the two grew up side by side. What began as supervised interaction gradually turned into a routine that resembled something closer to sibling familiarity, running, playing, and sharing space during his early development. Adult male lions average around 400 pounds and are built for short bursts of explosive force. Their hunting method relies on rapid acceleration and immediate control of the target, typically by securing the throat or muzzle to restrict breathing while using body weight to bring the animal down. Despite being raised in captivity, Aslan retained these same physical capabilities and behavioral responses. That Tuesday, with her father in Johannesburg and workers repairing outer fencing, Isabelle filmed content for a new YouTube channel centered on daily life with Aslan. She staged a birthday segment inside the enclosure, placing meat near the pool to control his position. Aslan had last been fed about 24 hours earlier. In the heat, he showed increased pacing. When he reached the setup, he consumed the meat quickly, scattering it across the concrete and disrupting the arrangement within seconds. Instead of stepping back, Isabelle moved closer, reaching toward the food while he was still actively feeding, placing herself within arm's length. She picked up an object and threw it. It landed near his forelimbs, triggering a startled response. His head lifted, ears moved forward, and his attention shifted away from the food and directly onto her. The dynamic changed instantly. As Isabelle turned her back and crouched to gather the scattered meat, Aslan lowered into a stalking posture behind her. His body went still, then moved. The distance closed in seconds. He charged from behind, striking high across her back and shoulders with his forelimbs and driving her forward onto the concrete. She lost balance before she could turn. His jaws followed immediately, closing around the side of her neck in a throat hold. The bite compressed the airway and major blood vessels. Rather than crushing, the force restricted airflow and reduced blood flow to the brain. His weight pinned her to the ground, keeping the hold stable while preventing any escape. Her movements weakened quickly. With her airway squeezed and blood flow reduced, her attempts to push up or reach back lost strength almost immediately. Her hands pressed against his forelimb and jaw, but the grip stayed firm. Each breath became shorter than the last, stopping before her lungs could fully fill. Aslan stayed low and steady, his forelimbs pressed across her upper body, while his jaws held tight at the side of her neck. The grip didn't shake or thrash. It stayed controlled, tightening slightly as she moved. Her legs shifted briefly against the ground, then slowed. Her early resistance faded into uncoordinated movement as lack of oxygen set in. Within seconds, she lost strength. Her arms dropped and she couldn't push him off. Her breathing became weak, uneven, then stopped as blood flow to the brain dropped. Aslan held on a few moments longer, then released and stepped back, staying nearby but calm. He didn't keep attacking. A worker found the scene at 4:15 p.m. while checking water. Authorities were called, and Aslan was later tranquilized and secured. The coroner confirmed fatal neck trauma, with airway compression and carotid artery restriction leading to rapid loss of consciousness. The enclosure was deemed functional, though additional safety measures were later implemented. Aslan was relocated and the property was sold the following year. She turned her back for just a moment inside a place built to keep danger out, but a year later, under the heat of a quiet wildlife park in Queensland, a content creator would step over a barrier himself, walking straight toward a 6-foot bird, armed with a blade no one walks away from. It was August 9th, 2018, at a quiet wildlife park in tropical Queensland, where heat pressed down over still enclosures and dry soil lay undisturbed beneath scattered shade. A low barrier separated visitors from open ground, and the air held a tense stillness, broken only by distant movement beyond the fence. Declan Fossey had built his YouTube channel around wildlife rehabilitation on a 40-acre property outside Bundaberg, Queensland. At 27, he combined hands-on experience with formal training, producing steady content that followed injured animals, relocations, and daily care routines. routines. The channel had grown enough to support his permits and supplement his part-time work at a veterinary clinic. One of his most recognizable animals was Spur, a cassowary raised from a juvenile after losing its mother in a road incident. Because of early human exposure, Spur could not be released and remained in a controlled enclosure with double-gate entry and solid fencing. A low internal divider used for feeding created a crossover point staff could step over. Cassowaries are among the most dangerous birds in the world, standing over 6 feet tall and capable of delivering powerful kicks with a dagger-like inner claw. Spur had reached near full size, weighing over 100 pounds, with strong territorial instincts and classified as a high-risk animal under Queensland wildlife guidance. On the morning of the incident, Spur showed signs of agitation, pacing, raised feathers, and low-frequency calls. Recent rain had left the enclosure muddy, reducing traction and making footing unstable near the divider. That afternoon, Declan filmed a milestone video with cameras set outside the enclosure. Spur stayed in the background, moving but not coming closer. Partway through, Declan stepped over the low divider for better lighting, entering without a barrier or tool. As soon as he crossed, Spur's posture changed. Body stiff, head lowered, focused on him. Declan noticed but kept moving, adjusting for the camera. The gap closed in seconds. Spur charged forward. Declan slipped on the wet ground, losing balance and slowing his reaction. The attack followed immediately. Spur leapt forward and delivered a downward kick. The first strike landed to the lower chest and abdomen, the inner claw making contact and penetrating deeply. The force drove Declan backward into the fence line. The impact bent his posture and disrupted his balance, leaving him partially turned and unable to regain stable footing. The claw made a deep cut, slicing through muscle and into his abdomen. It didn't crush. It cut clean but severe. Declan dropped to one knee, trying to steady himself against the fence. Spur shifted to the side, then gave a second shorter kick to the same spot, making the injury worse without staying in contact. After that, Spur backed off a few feet, still watching him but not attacking again. This kind of reaction is typical when the goal is to drive a threat away, not chase it. Declan remained conscious for several seconds. He attempted to stand, placing one hand against the fence, but his movement slowed as internal damage progressed. Penetrating abdominal trauma often presents with delayed external bleeding while internal hemorrhage accelerates. Blood loss began rapidly inside the abdominal cavity, reducing blood pressure and impairing coordination. He took a step along the fence line but collapsed shortly after, unable to maintain balance. His attempts to call out weakened as circulation dropped. Within a minute, his movements became uncoordinated, then minimal. Emergency calls were placed immediately. Workers accessed the enclosure through the double gate system, delaying entry. By the time they reached him, he was unresponsive. Paramedics attempted stabilization before air transport, but his condition deteriorated from internal bleeding. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The coroner confirmed fatal abdominal penetration with major organ damage from a high-force cassowary strike. The enclosure remained intact. Entry occurred through a crossover point without protective measures, with muddy ground contributing to unstable footing. Following the incident, updated protocols were issued for all licensed handlers in the region, requiring physical barriers or tools when inside high-risk enclosures and restricting solo entry during filming. Spur was relocated to a specialized containment facility designed for large, high-risk birds, where access is limited to trained staff under controlled conditions. He crossed a barrier built to keep him safe and paid for it in seconds. But years earlier, inside a quiet rural home, a retired woman would sit down beside a 20-foot python she trusted, unaware that once it tightened, there would be no barrier left at all. It was March 3rd, 2015, and a living room sat under warm indoor lighting, the air still and controlled, furniture arranged neatly around a low seating area. The space showed signs of routine handling, with equipment nearby and little movement, creating a calm environment that felt familiar, contained, and undisturbed. Gloria Tennyson, 56, inherited her late husband's exotic reptiles in 2009, eventually keeping only one python, Duchess. A retired school secretary, she treated the large snake more like a pet than a high-risk animal. She lived alone in a single-story ranch house on 12 wooded acres, with the nearest neighbor about a quarter-mile away. Over time, her handling became casual. She allowed Duchess to move freely indoors and stayed close as it explored. Despite warnings from her children, she continued her routine without accounting for the snake's behavior in the days after feeding. Reticulated pythons can exceed 20 feet and weigh over 200 pounds. They are non-venomous constrictors that subdue prey by rapidly coiling moving and applying pressure that restricts blood flow and breathing. Their backward curving teeth are designed to anchor into tissue, and their muscular bodies can generate enough force to overpower large animals, including adult humans. Earlier that day, Gloria noticed Duchess moving more than usual a few days after feeding, a period when large constrictors can be more responsive to movement and contact. Experts warn against handling them alone during this time, but Gloria had grown used to being around the snake. That evening, she sat on the kitchen floor as Duchess moved across her legs and lower torso, several feet of its body draped over her, the thick midsection pressed against her as it shifted, a position she had become accustomed to over time. The change was immediate. Duchess struck forward, her head snapping toward Gloria's upper arm. The bite landed and held. The strike distance was short, consistent with close contact defensive or feeding responses in large pythons. Within a fraction of a second, the snake's body followed. The first coil wrapped around Gloria's torso in a single, forceful loop. A second followed, then a third, each one layering over the previous. The pressure increased rapidly. Constriction in large pythons occurs almost immediately after a successful bite, with coils forming in under 2 seconds. As Gloria exhaled during the initial contact, the coils tightened, preventing a full inhalation. She attempted to pull her arm free, pressing her hands against the snake's body. The muscle beneath her palms contracted further. This tightening response is mechanically triggered by movement and pressure, not intention. The coils shifted higher along her chest, compressing the rib cage and limiting expansion. The weight forced her onto her back against the kitchen floor. Her breathing became shallow and irregular. The pressure around her ribs increased with each second, restricting both airflow and circulation. Her movement slowed as strength decreased, and her attempts to push free became less effective. Loss of effective breathing combined with reduced blood flow would begin affecting consciousness quickly under sustained constriction. Within a short period, her movement slowed and then stopped. Current forensic understanding shows that in large constrictor attacks, loss of consciousness often occurs from rapid circulatory collapse rather than suffocation alone. The pressure from the coils restricts blood flow, preventing the heart from circulating effectively while also limiting breathing. Duchess maintained her coils, continuing to apply steady pressure. Large constrictors often hold this position well beyond the point of movement, ensuring the body no longer responds. She remained coiled for an extended time before gradually loosening, staying nearby through the night with part of her body still draped close. The next morning at around 11:45 a.m., Gloria's grandson, Mike Tennyson, arrived to retrieve a chainsaw. After getting no response, he used a spare key, found her in the kitchen with the snake nearby, exited immediately, and called emergency services. Responders arrived shortly after, and animal control secured the snake. The coroner confirmed death due to constriction, with evidence of circulatory collapse and restricted respiration. Multiple rib fractures and extensive bruising were documented, along with bite marks on her upper arm, consistent with a reticulated python. The absence of defensive injuries indicated rapid immobilization. Duchess was removed from the property and transferred to a licensed reptile facility. Local officials reviewed regulations regarding private ownership of large constrictor snakes following the incident. Gloria's funeral was held privately, with her family requesting donations to local animal shelters. She sat still in a place that felt completely safe as the pressure slowly closed in. But years later, inside a concrete enclosure on the edge of a quiet facility, a man would lean just a little too far over dark water, and something waiting beneath it would rise fast enough to pull him under before he could even step back. It was September 12, 2018, in a quiet concrete enclosure on the outskirts of a provincial facility, where stagnant water sat dark and still beneath heat-stained walls. The surface barely moved, disturbed only by faint ripples, while rusted railings and damp edges suggested long-term neglect and minimal maintenance. Jerome Castile had spent over 30 years working Mississippi River levees, known as a reliable heavy equipment operator. In 2012, he obtained a rare permit to keep rook, a Nile crocodile, raising and maintaining it alone in a custom enclosure behind his home. Private ownership of this species in Louisiana required strict state permitting and containment standards, which he had met at the time. After being diagnosed with kidney disease in 2018, his strength declined. Realizing he could no longer safely handle the animal, he arranged for Rook's transfer to a wildlife sanctuary and personally assisted with the move, explaining its feeding routine and behavior. The sanctuary covered 12 acres of converted rice fields with connected enclosures and narrow service corridors. Nile crocodiles are among the largest living reptiles, capable of exceeding 16 feet and delivering extremely high bite force. At 11 feet and roughly 800 pounds, had spent years associating human presence at the enclosure's edge with feeding. That conditioning, known in captive management, can increase the likelihood of approach behavior when a person stands at the perimeter. Jerome returned in September for a final visit. That afternoon, Rook had already been fed but remained active, staying near the the surface along the enclosure edge. Post-feeding activity is not unusual, especially in warm conditions when metabolism remains elevated. With limited staff on site, Jerome was allowed into a service corridor separated from the water by a 4-foot concrete barrier. That barrier height is below the recommended safety standard for large crocodilians, which typically require higher walls or secondary containment. He brought raw chicken and a long-handled grabber tool, intending to present food from a distance as he had done before. Rook's position indicated elevated risk. The animal held a low-profile posture just beneath the surface, with only the eyes and nostrils visible, oriented directly toward the source of movement. Jerome extended the grabber tool over the barrier, holding the meat a few feet above the waterline. To stabilize himself, he leaned forward, shifting his center of gravity beyond the barrier. This reduced his ability to step back quickly if the animal surged. The attack followed immediately. Rook propelled upward from the water using a rapid tail-driven thrust, covering several feet in a fraction of a second. His jaws opened and closed around Jerome's upper torso. The initial contact point appears consistent with the shoulder and upper chest region, areas within reach given the height and angle over the barrier. The force of the bite displaced Jerome's balance. His footing failed, and both went over the barrier into the enclosure, entering the water almost simultaneously. Once submerged, Rook maintained his hold. Crocodilian teeth are conical and designed to grip rather than slice, preventing easy withdrawal once engaged. Jerome attempted to surface, but the animal's body mass and positioning kept him pinned. The water depth allowed Rook to initiate a rotational maneuver. The crocodile began a death roll, rotating its body along its longitudinal axis. This behavior is used to destabilize prey and apply torque, increasing tissue damage and disorientation, rather than immediately dismembering large prey. Each rotation pulled Jerome through the water, preventing coordinated movement. The sustained bite pressure and rotation resulted in severe trauma, including rib fractures and compromised lung function. Water inhalation likely began during this phase as the airway was intermittently submerged. Within moments, Jerome's movement slowed as breathing became restricted under trauma and submersion. Staff approached but held at the perimeter, following protocol that prohibits entry during an active crocodile attack. Emergency services were called immediately. Responders arrived around 2:47 p.m., delayed by the rural access. By then, the struggle had ended, and Rook remained at the far side of the enclosure. Recovery required tranquilizing the animal and lowering the water level, continuing into the evening. The coroner confirmed severe upper torso trauma, deep bite wounds, multiple rib fractures, and a punctured lung. Drowning was listed as the primary cause of death. The incident prompted a review of enclosure design, supervision, and access procedures. Rook was relocated to a higher security facility, and the sanctuary temporarily closed for safety upgrades. He leaned just far enough for something beneath the surface to take him in seconds. But years earlier, on a quiet farm in Hokkaido, a woman would turn her back inside a pen she thought she understood as a 450-pound bear closed the distance without making a sound. It was October 17, 2016, at a residential edge where a private enclosure sat behind aging metal fencing, the ground worn from routine feeding and maintenance, with tools left nearby and the air under overcast skies, giving the space an ordinary calm that masked the risks built into its design. Hana Kobayashi had spent her life on her family's farm in Shibecha, working potato and sugar beet fields across eastern Hokkaido. At 31, she remained closely tied to the land and its animals. In 2014, she found an orphaned Usuri brown bear cub near a drainage ditch and kept it, feeding it livestock milk replacer instead of reporting it. What began as temporary became routine. As Kumo grew, Hana handled him daily, feeding, cleaning his enclosure, and occasionally leading him short distances with a chain collar. By 2016, he had reached adult size, but was still kept in a makeshift enclosure of fencing and wooden posts, lacking proper reinforced barriers. Despite concerns, Hana continued treating him as a domesticated animal. The farm sat in a valley bordered by dense forest, natural habitat for wild brown bears. Adult males can exceed 600 pounds and deliver powerful forelimb strikes. Kumo, around 450 pounds, was smaller, but still capable of lethal force. By mid-October, bears enter hyperphagia, a feeding phase marked by increased food seeking and reduced tolerance for proximity, even with familiar humans. In the days before the incident, Kumo's behavior changed. He paced along the fence, wore down paths, and vocalized more. During feeding, he positioned himself between Hana and the food, and lingered longer near feeding areas, signs of food guarding that went unaddressed. On October 17th, after the first frost, Hana entered the enclosure around 9:15 a.m. with tools to repair fencing near a water trough. A nearby worker saw her go in, noting Kumo was moving along the far side, watching intermittently. The attack began while Hana knelt at the trough with her back turned. Kumo approached from behind at a steady pace without vocalizing, closing the distance to a few feet before contact. The first strike came from above, a downward blow from from his forepaw that made contact with the back of her head and upper shoulders. The force drove her forward into the edge of the trough. Such strikes are consistent with documented bear attacks, where forelimb force is used to destabilize. The impact caused immediate loss of balance and disorientation. As she fell, Kumo shifted his weight forward. His jaws followed, clamping onto her head and upper neck. Brown bears typically target the head and neck during attacks, using bite force to incapacitate quickly. The bite applied crushing pressure across the skull and cervical spine. Her attempts to push away were limited by her position beneath his body mass. The attack continued in short, controlled movements. Kumo remained over her, maintaining contact with both forelimbs and jaws. There was no prolonged struggle. Incapacitation often occurs within seconds due to combined blunt force and bite trauma. Movement decreased rapidly, then stopped. Kumo stayed within the enclosure, moving a short distance away but remaining alert. When Hana did not exit, a nearby worker approached and saw her lying beside the trough, with the bear still present. He withdrew immediately and contacted emergency services. Police arrived but could not enter while the bear remained active. Wildlife personnel were called in and used a tranquilizer rifle to sedate Kumo from outside the enclosure. A delay before entry is standard, as sedation takes several minutes to take full effect. Once the animal was immobilized, responders entered. Hana was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner reported severe cranial and cervical trauma, including skull fractures and spinal disruption. The injury pattern, blunt force followed by a crushing bite, is consistent with recorded fatal brown bear attacks. Authorities determined Kumo could not be safely relocated due to habituation and human imprinting, and he was euthanized the following day. The incident led to stricter enforcement of wildlife regulations on privately raised predators. Hana's death highlighted the risk of keeping a wild apex animal in confinement, where early familiarity does not persist into adulthood, especially during seasonal feeding periods. She turned her back inside a space she believed she understood, and it ended in seconds. But 2 years earlier, in a quiet backyard in Atherton, a wildlife handler would spot a gate left just slightly open as a 120-pound chimpanzee stepped out toward a yard full of running children. It was July 13th, 2014, in a quiet residential backyard in Atherton, where late afternoon sunlight settled across trimmed grass and wooden fencing. Toys lay scattered across the yard, and a side gate near the fence line sat slightly misaligned, its latch not fully secured. Benoit Harcourt had spent 8 years working at a wildlife sanctuary before moving to a rural property outside Atherton in 2009. His experience with non-domestic animals shaped how he managed Kiro, an adult male chimpanzee he kept in a reinforced enclosure. Weighing over 120 pounds, Kiro had the strength and unpredictability typical of great apes. Benoit followed strict containment rules, limiting direct interaction and relying on separation systems designed to prevent direct contact. The enclosure reflected that caution: 8-foot steel fencing, a concrete base, and a double-gate entry system. The inner gate used a spring-loaded latch that had begun sticking in humid conditions. Benoit had already planned to replace it, but it had not yet been fixed. That afternoon, guests gathered for a children's birthday party. Movement increased across the yard, running, shouting, shifting patterns of motion. Cairo had been active earlier, moving along the enclosure and reacting to the noise, behavior consistent with heightened arousal in captive primates exposed to stimulation. At around 3:15 p.m., Benoit noticed the inner gate slightly open. The latch had failed, and Kiro moved through without hesitation. His movement into the yard was controlled, but alert, reacting to kids running, noise, and movement. Benoit stepped in front of him, placing himself between Cairo and the nearest group. He raised his voice in a familiar way, trying to redirect him. Kiro paused, but only briefly. His focus locked onto Benoit, and his body didn't relax. His shoulders lifted, arms hung forward, and his stance stiffened, clear signs of rising tension. Benoit held his position, trying not to make sudden moves, but Kiro started coming toward him. At first it looked controlled, slow steps, steady eye contact, but halfway in, it changed. His body tensed, his head lowered slightly, and his pace sped up. The shift was sudden. Then he lunged. The hit landed high on Benoit's chest and shoulders, pushing him backward and knocking him off balance right away. Before he could recover, Kiro was already on him, grabbing and dragging him to the ground. They hit hard, and there was no space between them after that. Kiro stayed on top, leaning his weight forward. His hands came down in quick, repeated hits while he pushed in to bite. The first bites landed on Benoit's arms as he tried tried to protect himself, then moved to the shoulder and upper chest when his guard dropped. Each bite was fast and strong, clamping down and pulling before shifting again. The hits didn't stop, keeping him pinned the whole time. Benoit tried to push him off, pressing against his shoulders and neck, but it didn't work. Every move was stopped right away. When he turned to one side, Kiro followed. When he tried to roll, the grip tightened and pulled him back down. The attack stayed close and non-stop, with no break to get away. The ground made it harder to move. Every shift gave Kiro more control. His grip kept changing. Hands, then bite, then hands again, never staying in one place long enough to break free. Within minutes, Benoit's movements slowed. His arms dropped lower, no longer able to block effectively. His reactions became delayed, then uneven. The resistance faded as blood loss and shock set in. Kiro continued for a short time after that, then stopped once Benoit no longer moved. He stepped away, breathing hard, but stayed nearby, watching and alert, as the yard went still again. Emergency services were called right away. People tried to help Benoit, but his condition got worse quickly. He lost consciousness before responders arrived and was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner confirmed he died from severe injuries, including heavy tissue damage, major blood loss, and blunt force trauma consistent with a chimpanzee attack. Bite wounds were found across his upper body, but the cause of death was the combined effect of the injuries and bleeding. Kiro was secured by animal control and later euthanized following a legal review. Investigators identified the failed latch and the high stimulation environment as contributing factors, showing how a controlled setting shifted into a fatal encounter within seconds.